Welcome back to Dreams of the Nameless, where Japan decides it's going to start killing whales again in this dystopian moment.
Japan has resumed commercial whaling after leaving the International Whaling Commission, otherwise known as the IWC. It's an international body now comprised of about 89 nations, which was established originally to provide, and this is according to their charter, provide for the proper conservation of whale stocks and thus make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. Japan presented the proposal late last year to the IWC, requesting the authorization of commercial whaling with catch limits and other regulations being established by the body. The Commission then rejected the proposal and furthermore concluded that the new purpose of the IWC was no longer to maintain the population levels for commercial hunting, but was now instead primarily focused on the conservation of whales, which for me, I found that to be a good change in mission overall.
Yeah, I would also
Japan,
support that change generally.
Oh yeah, I thought it was great. However, Japan disagreed. They renounced membership in the commission, effective at the beginning of this year, with the stated intent of resuming commercial whaling, which they have in fact begun doing.
Well, that's a lot like what we just did when there was a court that asked the United States to stop doing something, and we then stomped our feet and left the court and then denounced the court's findings and just went on ahead with I think it was a weapons deal issue or something like that. I don't know. I can't remember what it was, unfortunately. But go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty common political move, unfortunately. The catch to all this, of course, is that Japan never actually truly stopped whaling to begin with. The IWC actually placed a moratorium on all whale hunting in 1986, and they did this to allow the whale populations to return to pre-industrial stock levels. I can't remember the wording they used. It was something weird, but they want the population to return to what it was before they had organized industrial whaling. However, it also kind of added these loopholes when they did that. They said that populations who continue to hunt for a very limited number of whales specified by them, who are indigenous to that country, like Inuit peoples here in the U.S., they are still allowed to hunt. And then the other loophole they added was countries are allowed to submit research permits, is how they phrased it. These research permits mean that there is a certain number of whaling that the country establishes, not that the commission establishes, that this permit allows so that they can do research. And I don't know what research requires the killing of whales. I couldn't really find any information on that. But apparently the commission thinks that there's research that, yep, you can go ahead and just kill whales. Since the beginning of the moratorium, however, Japan continued to catch between 200 and 1,200 whales every year under this guise of research. In fact, in 2014, in at least one instance, the UN actually demanded that Japan cease this so-called research program because it didn't follow the IWC guidelines or the research protocols. So in other words, it was literally just commercial or sport hunting with the drapery of research. So Japan actually stopped the program, but then quickly authorized a nearly identical one with a new name. According to the New York Times, officials in Tokyo and local authorities in Japan actually, and this is a quote, celebrate the practice as a tradition with a long history and cultural significance akin to the hunting of whales in countries such as Norway and Iceland, which I'm going to break and say both of those, they're actually not members of the IWC, which is why they continue to whale. And it continues to say, or indigenous communities in the United States and Canada. So they're likening their activities to what essentially is going on north of the Arctic Circle in very small population villages in which the vast majority of their sustenance has to come from the ocean because it is extremely difficult or expensive to get food to their village. Japan, I don't think has that problem.
No.
But maybe I'm reading something wrong in that. So far as I can find, Japanese whaling was never really a primary means of sustenance. It wasn't until after World War II, in which the American occupying forces directed by General MacArthur actually encouraged the Japanese to use whale meat as a cheap and abundant source of protein for the now devastated country. So for a short period following World War II, it was actually a government-subsidized staple food that became widespread throughout Japan and peaked in the 1960s, early 1960s. It continued then to be offered through government programs like school lunches until the 1980s when the moratorium began. So it was never truly like a cultural staple. It was always, some essentially indigenous villages along the coastlines that would do it for sustenance. Since this moratorium in 1986, the government actually continued to subsidize the whaling industry in their so-called research to the tune of like $46 million a year. And they brought in about 3,000 tons of whale meat. Now that's down from the peak of 226,000 tons 57 years ago. And I think I misspoke. They're bringing in about 3,000 tons, not 3,000 pounds. So still a substantial amount, but far less than the peak. The continuing whaling activities of Japan, Norway, Iceland, these other countries, as a commercial industry that's damaging to the environment. We should stop this entirely. There shouldn't be anybody whaling. I think maybe that we could make a provision for, the Inuit peoples in Alaska and Canada.
Do you have in your notes anything about the actual process of whaling? Because I guess I'm just thinking with a mammal of that size, it must just be a horrific affair.
So I didn't actually specifically research that, but in college I took this class on Moby Dick, and we read about it then, and from what little I garnered through these articles, it hasn't really changed a whole lot. Now they use, it's really fucked up, they use these gas-powered, essentially guns, that shoot harpoons that explode. And it's supposed to be more humane because the explosion kills the animal immediately. In antique times, back when they were using wooden ships and pulleys and so on, and people would just go out in rowboats and throw harpoons at them, they would just keep harpooning them until they died. And so it could take hours. I know probably even longer than that, but it was just a really horrific process overall. So they argue that the exploding harpoons is much more humane.
So they try and shoot it in the head and it just explodes and
yeah, basically. Yeah.
And I imagine they're probably pretty good shots because they don't want to fuck up the meat.
Assuming they even care. Because, I don't know how callous any of these whalers are and so forth, but I think, the guidelines would probably be, be as accurate as possible to eliminate suffering.
No, I'm saying they're probably accurate to increase the amount of profit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That would make sense.
Because obviously if you blow off half of the whale, then that's no good.
Yeah, and then it's worthless. Then they basically just pull them onto the ship. They gut them. They, pull the meat and whatever else they want off the body, off the carcass. And then some places, it seems like they may just dump the rest overboard. But I was kind of led to believe now they might actually be keeping the entire carcass. In particular, Japan might be. Because whale bone might go to use for other things, and whale intestine and yada yada, they might be using it for other things, aside from food. So the process is not super, but we've made it, industrially efficient as much as you can when you're murdering something. So that's a bonus. I don't really know if that's a positive, ultimately.
No, I only bring it up because I figured that when, especially at its height, I imagine that what they were willing to do to meet the demand for, what did you say, 260,000 tons? 22,000 tons? Or
226,000 tons.
I imagine that it was probably pretty horrific.
Yeah.
And these are pretty intelligent mammals as well.
Yeah, I think
so if you subscribe to the suffering is bad and is made worse by the level of sentience of the creature, then can't think of a whole lot worse than whales, dolphins. Maybe I'm outing myself as not being a super animal science buff, but is this a whole lot different than if they were just mass murdering chimpanzees or?
Well, from what I understand, there are people that hunt gorilla or such, large apes.
Commercially?
But, not commercially, but I think it's just as bad as that.
Well, honestly, at the risk of this going long, go ahead and finish your.
Really, the main point I wanted to get to, if nothing else, in the rest of the notes I prepare here, is that there's actually a lot of ways in which, to bring in another topic, a lot of ways in which whales benefit the environment. One of the more interesting ones, which I just would not have expected at all, is that their feces is actually rich in nutrients. And so they dive very deep, they eat, they hunt, they whatever down in the depths. They come to the surface for air, and then they defecate, for, lack of a crass term. And these fecal plumes, as they call them, actually...
That's what I was waiting for.
Yeah, that's what the articles call them. So, take it for what it is. The fecal plumes actually support all kinds of other life like plankton and create a biodiversity all their own. And so in this really interesting, kind of counterintuitive research, when you decrease whale populations, the biodiversity of the ocean decreases. Because where whales are present, there's whale poo, which then creates whole new communities of life. And then these communities of life also act as carbon sinks. The plankton and the fish absorb carbon, and then when they die or what have you, they usually sink to the ocean and more or less remove the carbon from the system.
Yep.
So, it's a really good thing that those exist. Another way, bringing that into the debate here, another way where the whales are very beneficial is that one study, because the whales themselves are carbon sinks, one study found that 80 whales...
That was the part when I read through your notes that I found to be the most interesting, was that how much carbon you said that they could actually just sort of take in to their own bodies.
Yeah, it's surprising, because it's 80 whales can sequester as much carbon annually as 200 acres of dense forest, and that's just the whales on their own. That's not to mention all the the various life and plants and various diversity that travels with them because of their poop and etc. They also churn the ocean waters, which spreads that diversity throughout the vertical depths as well as just along the surface. So there's all these ways in which they themselves are carbon sinks, and then when they die, in a phenomena that biologists call whale fall, the carcass slowly sinks to the bottom of the ocean and becomes a habitat all of its own that other life and animals and so on will subsist on for years, and again increasing the overall biodiversity.
Well, yeah, how many of those old and some of the newer ocean documentaries have you seen where the coolest parts are where they find the strange life around the bones of whales?
Oh yeah, it's all the time.
All the time. I can remember images from those shows where they're in little submarines or whatever, and it's a shitty camera view, but you can see, and then they're talking, and it's a British accent, and you imagine the fecal plumes are most dense.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too that I found, and I don't know if I put this in the notes, is that the 3 types of whales that they're allowing themselves to hunt, they're all a type of baleen whale, and they're on the smaller side. So when you see these pictures, they look like whales, and you can see them, but in comparison to the people and to the boats, they're only about 20 feet long. And so I think it's bad enough that you're killing whales, period. But they're not hunting, the massive species where you can get many, many tons of meat, essentially. They're hunting these smaller species that are more or less the size of killer whales. So they have to hunt even more of them to get a quantity of
Wouldn't
meat.
it be worse if they were hunting the gigantic ones? Isn't it the larger the animal, the less population?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's horrendous all around.
Yes, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying there's less. I have less clarity in stating that. Is it better or worse for them to hunt smaller ones? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, because I wasn't.
Granted, the whole thing is bad. Period.
Yeah, they don't have accurate numbers to a very precise degree of what whale populations are, and so it's hard for me to say because I didn't find good information on that. But if you're hunting a small whale and you have to get 150 of them to meet X quota, as opposed to maybe you could just kill
I
one
understand.
large whale.
I see where you're going there, but nonetheless, I would.
I just prefer if they just didn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which ultimately brings me to the final point, in that there is a positive side to the story. Most of the sources that I found say that commercial whaling is not likely to succeed in Japan. To begin with, there's basically no demand. Since the 1960s, it's been on the decline. Since the 1980s, it hasn't really been even given to the public in general. It's only found in niche markets. The vast majority of people who have eaten it or who do eat it are mostly aging boomers, and it's a flavor of their childhood, is how one article put it. It's an expensive nostalgia or novelty item that you can't just pick up at your local grocery store. So the other factor that plays into this, according to a lot of the articles that I read, is that while the commercial whaling has restarted, the government's also removing the subsidy. So they're not going to pay any more money to keep the industry alive, which means now they're in competition with other more lucrative fishing industries for pay for employees and for prices of product and so forth. And that alone might drive it out of business. So given the fact that there's no market and the competition and the lack of the subsidy all combine into this kind of perfect storm that they may ultimately just fail. While there is no other market or what have you, there's these whaling industries in Japan, and they are trying to find new markets. They want to sell them to hootie snoot, fancy, high-end restaurants. Another president of some whaling organization in Japan was quoted as saying, "We've done nothing wrong, and we have no plans to stop. We're continuing whale hunts that began over 400 years ago, and if this generation ended them, we would live with the shame forever." While I agree about shame, I think it would be more shameful to be a part of the generation that future generations would look back on and say, you were the fools who actively fought to continue an industry of industrial murder that hastens the demise of all known life on the planet. I think that's the shame, not that you were part of the generation that ended whaling.